The restaurant was crowded, just like it was every Friday night. The air inside smelled like expensive steak, fresh coffee, and the heavy perfume of the women waiting for their tables. It was a place where people came to see and be seen, a high-end spot in the middle of the city where the lights were always dimmed low to make everything look a little more magical. But for Elena, there was no magic. There was only work. She moved through the tight spaces between the tables with a heavy black tray balanced perfectly on one shoulder. Her feet hurt. They had been hurting since the early afternoon, and she still had hours to go before her shift was over. She was dressed in the standard uniform, a crisp white shirt that was starting to wrinkle under the pressure of the busy night, a long black apron tied tightly around her waist, and comfortable black shoes that had lost their cushioning months ago. To the customers sitting in the plush velvet booths, she was just part of the furniture. She was the server, a faceless person who brought them food and refilled their water glasses. They didn't know her name, and they didn't really care to know it. "Excuse me, miss, we've been waiting for 10 minutes, a man in a gray suit said sharply as she tried to squeeze past. He didn't look at her face, he was looking at his watch, annoyed that his expensive evening wasn't moving fast enough. "I am so sorry, sir," Elena said automatically. Her voice was soft, polite, and tired. "I will be right back with your order." She didn't take it personally. She couldn't afford to. If she took every rude comment personally, she would have quit years ago. She had learned to build a wall between her feelings and her job. She smiled, nodded, and did what she was asked to do. It was a survival mechanism. She wiped down tables, cleared away dirty plates, and took orders from people who were too busy talking on their phones to even look at her. In the corner of the large room, away from the busiest tables, stood a beautiful grand piano. It was polished to a shine, reflecting the soft amber lights that hung from the ceiling. During the weekends, a professional band came into play, but on weeknights like this, it usually sat silent. It was just for decoration, another expensive object to make the place look classy. But to Elena, that piano was the only thing in the room that felt real. Every time she passed by it, carrying a heavy tray of dirty dishes or a pot of fresh coffee, her eyes would drift toward it. It was an accident, a reflex she couldn't control. She would look at the black and white keys and feel a strange twitching in her fingers. It was a muscle memory, a ghost of a life she used to have. She remembered what it felt like to sit on that bench, to feel the cold ivory keys under her fingertips, and to hear a sound that could silence a noisy room. She remembered the power she used to feel when she played. Elena hadn't always been a waitress. There was a time, not so long ago, when the world thought she was going to be a star. She grew up in a small house filled with music. Her father loved old records, and her mother had a beautiful singing voice. When she was 5 years old, they bought an old, second-hand piano. It was out of tune and some of the keys stuck, but Elena loved it. She would sit for hours, pressing the keys and trying to mimic the sounds she heard on the radio. It turned out she was a natural. By the time she was 10, she was playing better than adults who had been studying for years. Her teachers told her she was a prodigy. They told her she had a gift. She won competitions. She played recitals. The feeling of being on stage, with the spotlight hitting her face and the room completely quiet, waiting for her to move her hands, that was the only time she ever felt truly alive. She didn't need to speak to communicate, the music spoke for her. When she played, she wasn't the shy girl from the wrong side of town. She was important. When she was 18, she received the letter she had been dreaming of. It was a full scholarship to a famous music conservatory in the city. It was her ticket out. It was her chance to become a real artist, to travel the world, and to do what she loved every single day. She remembered holding the letter, her hands shaking, reading the words over and over again. Her parents cried with happiness. It seemed like her life was finally going to begin. But life has a way of changing plans when you least expect it. Just weeks before she was supposed to leave for the conservatory, everything fell apart. Her father got sick. It happened suddenly and got worse very quickly. He couldn't work, the medical bills piled up, and the small savings her parents had put away for her disappeared in the blink of an eye. Without her father's income, and with the hospital taking every extra cent, there was no money to keep the house running, let alone support her moving away to study music. Elena remembered the night she made the decision. She sat at that old, out-of-tune piano in her living room while her mother slept in the next room, exhausted from crying and worry. Elena played one last song. It was a sad, slow melody that filled the small house. She knew she couldn't leave them like this. She couldn't chase her dream while her family drowned. So, she called the school the next day and declined the scholarship. She packed away her sheet music, put on her work shoes, and went out to find a job. That was 5 years ago. Now, at 23, her hands were rough from scrubbing tables and carrying heavy trays. The smooth fingers that used to fly across the keys were now dry and cracked. The dream of being a musician felt like a story she had read in a book once, a story that belonged to someone else. She told herself that she was okay with it. She told herself that growing up meant making sacrifices. She was helping her mother pay the bills, she was keeping food on the table. That was what mattered. But deep down, in a quiet place she tried to ignore, she felt a heavy sadness whenever she saw a piano. She walked past the grand piano in the corner again, wiping her hands on her apron. A family was sitting near it now, 2 young children fighting over a crayon while their parents looked at menus. The children were banging their hands on the table, making noise that annoyed the other guests. The piano sat silently behind them, ignored and untouched. Elena sighed and adjusted the tray on her shoulder. She had to get back to work. Table 7 needed their check, and Table 3 was asking for more napkins. She turned away from the piano and headed back into the chaos of the dining room. She moved quickly, keeping her head down, trying to be invisible. In a room full of people, she was the only one who was truly alone with her secrets. She cleared a table near the window, stacking the plates with a practiced rhythm. She could hear the chatter of the guests around her. They were talking about their jobs, their vacations, and the money they were making. She felt very small in the middle of it all. Just a few years ago, people used to listen to her. They used to clap for her. Now, they just looked through her. The restaurant noise seemed to get louder as the night went on. Glasses clinking, silverware jingling, people laughing and shouting over each other. It was a wall of sound that gave Elena a headache. She missed the silence of the music. She missed the control she had over the piano. When you play, you control the silence. You decide when the sound starts and when it stops. But here, she was just a passenger in someone else's noise. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was still early. Her feet throbbed in her shoes, a steady ache that shot up her calves. She took a deep breath, fixed the fake smile on her face, and picked up a tray full of drinks. She was good at pretending. She pretended she wasn't tired. She pretended she didn't mind the rude customers. And most of all, she pretended that she didn't still hear the music in her head, playing a soundtrack for a life she was forced to leave behind. She was just the waitress, and for now, that was all anyone would ever see. The music started out smooth and slow, filling the corners of the restaurant with a soft, jazzy tune. The pianist, an older gentleman with thinning gray hair and a tired face, had been playing for hours. He was a professional, hired to give the place a fancy feeling, but tonight, his hands were not obeying him. The arthritis in his joints was acting up, a sharp, throbbing pain that started in his wrists and shot all the way up to his elbows. Every time he pressed a key, it felt like a small electric shock. He tried to hide it. He kept his face calm and focused on the sheet music in front of him, but his fingers were moving slower than usual. He missed a note, then another. The usually fluid melody became jagged and uneven. The customers didn't seem to notice at first, they were too busy eating their steaks and talking loudly about their days. But the pianist knew. He could feel the control slipping away. Finally, in the middle of a song, he stopped. He let his hands fall into his lap and closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to fight the pain. The silence that followed was sudden and heavy. It felt like the room had been holding its breath, and now it was letting it out all at once. Without the music to cover it up, the noise of the restaurant rushed back in. The clattering of knives and forks against plates sounded 10 times louder. The laughter from the bar seemed harsh and sharp. The manager, a young man in a suit who was always rushing around, noticed the silence immediately. He hurried over to the piano, looking worried. "Is everything okay?" the manager asked, leaning in so the customers wouldn't hear. "Are you feeling all right?" The older man shook his head slowly. He rubbed his swollen knuckles with a look of deep frustration. "I can't do it tonight," he said softly, his voice full of regret. "My hands, they just won't work. I'm sorry, but I have to go." The manager looked panic-stricken. Music was the most important part of the restaurant's atmosphere. Without it, the place just felt like a noisy cafeteria. He looked around the room, hoping for a miracle, but there was none. Okay, the manager said, though he clearly wasn't okay. "Don't worry about it. Go home and rest. We'll figure something out." The pianist carefully closed the lid over the keys, packed up his sheet music with slow, painful movements, and walked out the front door. As the door clicked shut behind him, the room felt different. It felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people sitting in the chairs. The magic was gone. From across the room, Elena watched all of this happen. She was standing by the service station, refilling salt shakers, but she wasn't really thinking about the salt. Her eyes were fixed on the empty bench in front of the big grand piano. It looked lonely there in the corner, waiting for someone to sit down. The manager was pacing back and forth behind the bar now. He was frantically clicking around on a computer tablet, trying to find a playlist on their music system. He was sweating, his face red. The tablet, however, had other plans. The screen froze, then glitched. He tapped it harder, swearing under his breath. The technology wasn't helping. The mood in the restaurant was changing fast, and not in a good way. Without the soft piano music to soften the edges, the customers seemed agitated. A group of women at a large round table looked annoyed that they had to shout to hear each other over the noise of the kitchen. A couple near the window looked around the room with bored expressions, checking their watches and looking less impressed by the fancy ambience they had paid for. Elena could feel the tension in the air. It was like a storm was brewing. She knew that when the atmosphere in the restaurant got bad, the tips got worse. People were quicker to complain, quicker to snap at the staff. She braced herself for a long, Difficult shift. She picked up a clean cloth and walked out onto the floor to wipe down an empty table, keeping her head low. As she worked, she found herself getting closer to the piano. She wiped the table, then the chairs, taking longer than necessary. Her eyes drifted to the keyboard. The lid was open, revealing the black and white keys. They looked so inviting. They looked peaceful. A strong urge hit her. It was a physical feeling, like a pull in her chest. She remembered how it felt to sit there. She knew that if she sat down and played just a few chords, the mood in the room would settle. She knew she could fix the tension. She could turn the harsh noise back into something beautiful. The music was inside her, always bubbling just under the surface, waiting for a chance to come out. But then, the fear stepped in. It was a cold, heavy feeling that sat in her stomach. "Who do you think you are?" a voice in her head asked. It was the same voice that had kept her from playing for 5 years. "You are just a waitress. You look tired. Your apron is stained. If you play, they will laugh at you. They will look at you like you are crazy." She looked down at her hands. They were rough and red from the hot water and cleaning chemicals she used every day. Her fingernails were clipped short because long nails got in the way of her work. These didn't look like the hands of a musician. They looked like the hands of a worker. Elena took a step closer to the piano, then stopped. The manager was still struggling with the tablet. He looked like he was about to throw it across the room. A few customers were looking at the empty stage, confused. "Why did the music stop?" she heard one man ask his wife. Elena's heart began to beat faster. Thump thump. Thump thump. It was loud enough that she could hear it over the restaurant noise. She felt a sudden rush of adrenaline, the kind you get right before you do something scary. She thought about her father. She thought about the music they used to listen to together. She thought about the scholarship she never got to use. She had given up her dream for her family, and she didn't regret that choice. She would do it again. But did that mean she had to give up the music entirely? Did she have to kill that part of herself forever? The restaurant was getting louder by the minute. The clatter of dishes was irritating. People were tapping their feet impatiently. The whole place felt like it was vibrating with stress. It felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. And there, in the center of it all, was the piano. Silent. Waiting. Elena looked around to see if anyone was watching her. The other servers were busy running orders. The manager was still fighting with the sound system. The customers were busy looking at their menus or their phones. No one was paying attention to the tired waitress standing near the corner. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Her legs felt shaky, but she forced them to move. She took one small step toward the bench. Then another. It felt like walking through deep water, like the air was pushing against her. Her mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. What if she forgot the notes? It had been so long. What if her fingers were too stiff? What if the manager yelled at her for stopping work? The fear was strong, but the desire was stronger. The music was calling her. It was a chance to feel alive again, even if it was just for 5 minutes. It was a chance to stop being invisible and just be. She reached the piano. The wood of the bench looked smooth and cool. She stood in front of it for a long moment, just looking at the keys. They were black and white, orderly and perfect. The noise of the restaurant swirled around her: laughter, shouting, glass breaking, but it all seemed to fade away into the background as she focused on the instrument. She slowly reached down and untied her apron strings. The heavy black apron fell away, and she draped it over the corner of the piano. Without it, she felt strangely light, but also very exposed. She was just wearing her white shirt and black pants. She felt like she was taking off a costume and revealing who she really was. She looked at the manager one last time. He had finally given up on the tablet and was looking around the room with a helpless expression. He didn't notice Elena yet. No one did. She was still just the furniture. With a trembling hand, she reached out and touched the keys. They were cool under her fingertips. She sat down on the bench. It felt familiar, like meeting an old friend you haven't seen in years. She took another deep breath, straightened her back, and placed her hands in position. Her left hand settled on the lower notes, her right hand hovered over the high ones. The room was still loud. A waiter dropped a tray with a loud crash, making everyone jump. But Elena didn't jump. She closed her eyes for a split second, blocked out the world, and let her fingers drop. The sound that came out of the piano was not a soft, hesitant note. It was a chord, struck with confidence, that seemed to push the air right out of the room. It was deep, rich, and loud, much louder than the polite background music they were used to. The vibration from the strings hummed through the floorboards and up Elena's legs. For a second, it felt like the entire building shook. She didn't play a simple song. She didn't play the easy, light tunes that usually drifted through the restaurant while people ate. Instead, her hands launched into a complex, powerful piece. It started with low, rumbling bass notes that grabbed everyone's attention, followed immediately by a cascade of high, sparkling notes that danced over the top. It was dramatic and emotional. It was the kind of music that demanded you stop what you were doing and listen. The reaction didn't happen all at once. It happened like a wave moving across the water. At the table closest to the piano, a man was telling a loud story to his friends. He was waving his hands in the air, talking over the noise of the room. When the first chord hit, he kept talking for a few seconds, ignoring it. But then, the music changed. The melody became intricate and fast. The man's voice trailed off. He frowned, looking annoyed that something was interrupting his story. He turned his head toward the corner to glare at whoever had the nerve to play so loudly. But when he saw Elena, his glare turned into a look of confusion. He saw the waitress, the one who had refilled his water glass 20 minutes ago, sitting with her back straight, her hands flying over the keys. He closed his mouth. He forgot what he was saying. From there, the silence spread. A few tables away, a young woman was laughing at a joke her date had made. As the music grew louder, her laugh faded out. She turned to look at the piano, her eyes wide. She saw the intensity on Elena's face and stopped chewing her food. The music was pulling her in. She nudged her date, and he turned around too. The clatter of silverware against plates began to slow down. One by one, people put their forks down. The sound of a glass breaking in the kitchen didn't seem to matter anymore. The background hum of 50 different conversations, phones buzzing, chairs scraping, cash registers ringing started to dissolve. It was as if Elena's hands were weaving a spell, gathering up all the loose energy in the room and tying it together into one single, focused point. Sitting on the bench, Elena felt a change happening inside her, too. For the first 5 years, her hands had been tools for work. They scrubbed, they carried, they wiped. They were rough and tired. But the moment she touched the keys, they remembered who they used to be. The stiffness in her fingers vanished. It was like waking up a part of her brain that had been asleep for a long time. She didn't look at the audience. She couldn't. If she looked at them, she would see them staring, and the fear would come back. Instead, she stared at the keys, or sometimes she closed her eyes. She let the muscle memory take over. She played a melody that was full of sadness but also full of hope. It was the song she had played the night she gave up her scholarship, mixed with new feelings she had gathered over the years of hard work. She poured her tiredness, her frustration, and her hidden dreams into the music. Every note she struck was a word she wanted to say but never could. From the side of the room, the manager finally looked up from his tablet. He had been furiously trying to restart the music system, sweating with stress. He heard the piano playing and assumed the old pianist must have come back, or perhaps a relief player had arrived. He let out a sigh of relief and walked toward the stage to thank them. "It's about time," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie. As he got closer, he stopped. The person sitting at the piano wasn't the old man. It wasn't a professional musician in a suit. It was Elena. It was the quiet girl who never asked for a day off, who always took the extra shifts, who blended into the wallpaper. The manager froze. His mouth opened slightly. For a second, he wanted to rush over and pull her off the bench. He wanted to tell her to get back to work, to stop making a scene. But then, he really listened. He heard the skill in her playing. He heard the power and the soul in every chord. He realized that this wasn't a joke. This wasn't a waitress messing around. This was a master at work. He lowered his hand. He stood there in the middle of the walkway, blocking a waiter carrying a tray of soup, but he didn't care. He couldn't move. He was mesmerized. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. Just 5 minutes ago, the place had felt like a busy, noisy factory where people went just to eat. Now, it felt like a concert hall. The air felt heavy with emotion. People stopped looking at their phones. They stopped checking the time. They turned their chairs toward the piano. Even the kitchen staff, usually hidden behind the double swinging doors, had snuck out to look. The chef, a big man with a red face who was always yelling orders, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching Elena with a look of total respect. The line cooks peeked over his shoulders, drying their hands on their towels. Elena couldn't see them, but she could feel them. She could feel the energy in the room shifting from chaotic noise to focused attention. It was a strange feeling. For years, she had tried to be invisible, to not cause any trouble. She had wanted people to ignore her so she could get her work done and go home. But now, with every fiber of her being, she wanted them to see her. She played a run of fast notes, her left hand jumping down the keyboard while her right hand climbed higher and higher. The music built up to a climax. It was intense and beautiful. She hit a final, resolving chord that rang out clearly and held it, letting the sound vibrate in the air until it faded into nothingness. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. It was the kind of silence that you can almost hear. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the whole restaurant was holding its breath, afraid that if they made a sound, the magic would break. The heavy weight of the silence was actually heavy with respect. They weren't just waiting for the next song, they were processing what they had just witnessed. Elena sat there, her hands hovering over the keys. Her chest was heaving slightly, not from physical tiredness, but from the emotional release. She could feel the eyes of 100 people burning into her back. She waited for the spell to break. She waited for someone to cough, or for a glass to clink, signaling that life was going back to normal. But nobody moved. They just stared at the back of the young woman in the white shirt, wondering who she really was and where she had been hiding this incredible gift. The invisible waitress had disappeared, and in her place was a star they had never noticed. The silence that filled the room after the last note faded didn't last very long, but it felt like a lifetime to Elena. She sat on the bench, her hands still resting lightly on the keys, staring at the polished wood in front of her. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought the people in the front row might be able to see it beating through her shirt. For 5 years, she had successfully hidden this huge part of herself. She had kept it locked away tight, safe from judgment and safe from failure. Now, in just a few minutes, she had let it all out. Suddenly, the spell broke. It started with one person. A man sitting near the front, the same one who had been complaining about the wait time earlier, slowly raised his hands. He didn't just clap politely, he brought his hands together with a sharp, loud smack. It was a sound of pure shock and appreciation. Almost immediately, the woman next to him joined in. Then the table behind them. Within seconds, the quiet room exploded. It wasn't just a polite round of applause that you give when a song ends. It was a roar. It started as a wave of clapping and then grew into something much bigger. People at the tables began to stand up. One by one, they left their comfortable seats and their half-eaten meals to give Elena their full attention. Elena flinched slightly at the sudden noise. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. In her daily life, if people were looking at her, it usually meant she had made a mistake. It usually meant someone was angry about cold soup or a delayed order. But this was different. The energy coming from the crowd wasn't angry, it was amazed. They were looking at her like she was a celebrity who had just walked onto the stage, not the tired waitress who had been serving them all night. She slowly turned around on the bench to face the room. The sight that greeted her was overwhelming. The entire restaurant was on its feet. The businessmen in suits, the couples on dates, the loud groups of friends, the waiters standing by the kitchen doors, everyone was standing. They were smiling, clapping, and some were even wiping tears from their eyes. It felt surreal to Elena. Just 10 minutes ago, these same people had been ignoring her. They had looked right through her as if she were a ghost. They hadn't cared about her name or her story. But music has a strange power. It strips away the uniforms, the social classes, and the judgments. For those few minutes she played, she wasn't the help and they weren't the customers. They were just human beings listening to a story told through sound, and now that the story was over, they were thanking the storyteller. The manager stood near the bar, completely stunned. He watched the scene with his mouth slightly open. He looked at the cheering crowd and then back at Elena, trying to connect the two images in his head. He felt a strange mix of emotions. He was embarrassed that he had never known this about his own employee, but he was also incredibly proud. He realized that the person who made his coffee every morning carried a whole world inside her that he had never bothered to explore. He walked toward the stage, not to stop her, but to be closer to the magic. Elena's face felt hot. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and it made her feel shy and exposed. She gave a small, awkward wave to the room, not knowing what else to do. She didn't have the confident swagger of a professional performer who lived for the spotlight. She looked like a regular person who was surprised to find herself in a dream. The applause continued for a long time. It washed over her like a warm wave. As she looked out at the sea of faces, she saw something that surprised her. She saw respect. The grumpy man at the front table was clapping the loudest, nodding his head at her with a look that said, "I was wrong about you." A young teenager in the corner, who had been scrolling through his phone all night, was now recording her with his mouth open in awe. For the first time in years, Elena felt a sense of pride. She had buried her talent so deep under responsibility and exhaustion that she had started to believe it didn't matter anymore. She had told herself that her dreams were childish things that she had to grow out of. But seeing the reaction of these strangers, she realized that her talent wasn't dead. It was just dormant. It was still there, waiting for a moment to breathe. The reality of the situation started to sink in. She was still at work. She was still in her uniform. Well, she had taken the apron off, but she was still wearing the white shirt and black pants. She had tables to clear. She had dishes to wash. The moment was beautiful, but it was temporary. She couldn't just sit there and accept the applause forever. The real world was waiting for her to come back. She took a deep breath to steady her shaking hands and stood up from the bench. As she stood, the applause seemed to get even louder for a moment, as if acknowledging her presence. She gave another quick, shy smile. She didn't say anything into the microphone. She didn't take a bow like a star. She just looked at them with eyes that were a little bit shiny, acknowledging their kindness. Then, she did something that grounded the moment back in reality. She walked over to where she had draped her black apron over the piano. She picked it up and shook it out. The simple act of tying the apron strings back around her waist felt like taking off a superhero cape and putting on regular clothes again. The transformation was reversing, the musician was fading away, and the waitress was returning. As she tied the knot, the crowd began to settle down. People started sitting back down, but the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. It wasn't just a noisy restaurant anymore. There was a buzz in the air, a feeling that something special had just happened. People weren't checking their phones or looking at their watches anymore. They were looking at Elena with new eyes. Elena walked away from the piano. Her legs felt a little weak, but she held her head high. As she walked past the tables on her way back to the service station, something incredible happened. People stopped her. "That was beautiful," a woman whispered, reaching out to touch Elena's arm as she passed. "I had no idea," a man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're incredibly talented." Elena didn't know what to say. She just nodded and whispered, "Thank you." It felt strange to be thanked for doing something she loved, something she would have done for free. For years, her work had been met with complaints or silence. Now, she was being showered with gratitude. It was a foreign feeling, but it was a nice one. She reached the safety of the service station and leaned against the counter for a moment, letting out a long breath she didn't know she was holding. Her hands were still trembling slightly, buzzing with the energy of the music. The manager walked over to her. He didn't look stressed anymore. He looked impressed. "Elena," he said, his voice softer than usual. I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Elena looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I guess I didn't think it mattered." "It matters," the manager said firmly. "It matters a lot. That was the best thing we've ever had in this place." He looked at her for a moment, thinking. "Listen, take a 10-minute break. Go get some water. Catch your breath. You've earned it." Elena nodded and walked into the kitchen. The cooks, who were usually too busy to look up, stopped what they were doing. They cheered for her as she walked in. It was a loud, boisterous cheer from people who lived in a world of hot stoves and sharp knives. It was the most genuine approval she had received in a long time. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it in one long gulp, cooling her throat. Her hands were finally stopping their shaking. She looked around the kitchen. It was the same messy, hot, chaotic place it had been an hour ago. But somehow, it felt different. She felt different. She realized that she wasn't just a waitress who used to play piano. She was a musician who happened to be waiting tables. And that small shift in her mind made all the difference. She knew she couldn't quit her job. She knew she couldn't just run away and join a band tomorrow. She had bills to pay. But as she looked out at the dining room, seeing the customers talking excitedly and pointing at the piano, she knew that things had changed. She had opened a door that she thought was locked forever. She had let the light in. And for the first time in 5 years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, holding her tray, ready to serve, but with a song in her heart that everyone finally could hear. The rest of the night passed in a blur that felt completely different from the usual rush. Elena went back to her tables, refilling water glasses and clearing plates, but the weight of the air around her had changed. It wasn't heavy with tension anymore, it felt light, electric. As she moved through the room, she noticed that people were actually looking at her. They weren't looking through her or past her. They were making eye contact and smiling. At the table where the grumpy man in the gray suit sat, the atmosphere had done a complete 180. He wasn't checking his watch anymore. When Elena came over to refill his coffee, he stopped talking to his business partners. He looked up at her, and for the first time all night, he really saw her face. He didn't see a servant, he saw an artist. "You have a rare gift," he said to her. His voice wasn't sharp or demanding now. It was full of genuine respect. "Thank you for sharing that with us." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the restaurant's heating. "Thank you," she said softly. "I really needed to play that." When he left, he didn't just leave the standard tip. He left something much bigger, enough to cover her groceries for a week, tucked under the coffee cup with a small note that said simply, "For your future." It wasn't charity, it was recognition. It was a sign that her value went far beyond carrying trays. When the restaurant finally closed and the last customer walked out the door, the cleanup felt easier. The other servers, who usually just wanted to go home and crash, stayed a little longer. They were buzzing with excitement, asking Elena questions she hadn't been asked in years. "How long have you played?" one asked. "Why are you working here if you're that good?" asked another. Elena laughed, a genuine, happy laugh that surprised even her. She told them a little bit about her past, about the scholarship she gave up, and the life she had put on hold. They listened with wide eyes, seeing their co-worker in a completely new light. The kitchen staff, usually rough and joking, gave her respectful nods as she walked past. The hierarchy of the restaurant had shifted. The quiet girl at the bottom of the food chain had become the star of the show. The next morning, Elena woke up to a world that had changed while she slept. Her phone, which usually only had texts from her mom or notifications about her work schedule, was blowing up. It was full of messages, tags, and links. Confused, she clicked on one of the videos. It was a recording of her from the night before. The teenager in the corner had posted it, and it had gone viral overnight. The video was titled "Waitress at the Velvet Note Shocks Everyone." The quality was shaky and the sound was a bit distorted by the noise of the room, but the power of her playing was undeniable. The video had millions of views. The comments section was scrolling so fast she could barely read it, but the words jumped out at her. "This gave me chills. Who is she? She deserves to be famous. I was there, and it was magical. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she held the phone. For years, she had felt invisible. She had felt like her dreams had died in a small living room 5 years ago. But now, the whole world was seeing her. They weren't seeing a tired waitress, they were seeing the musician she had sacrificed to be. When she went into work that evening, she didn't know what to expect. She half wondered if the manager would be angry about the attention or worried that she would quit. Instead, he called her into his office before her shift. He was smiling, but he also looked serious. "Elena," he said, sitting down behind his desk. "I think we need to talk about your job." Her heart sunk. She thought he was going to fire her for causing a scene or for not sticking to serving. "I promise I won't play during service again," she started to say quickly. "I know I have a job to do." The manager held up his hand to stop her. "No, that's not it," he said. "Look at these reservations." He turned his computer screen around. It was full of booking requests for the upcoming weekend. Since that video went live, everyone wants to come here. They don't want the steak, Elena. They want to hear you play. He leaned forward, looking her in the eye. "I can't pay you a superstar salary yet. I know you need the stability of your waitress wages to help your family. But I don't want you to just be a server anymore. I want to hire you as our main weekend pianist. You serve the dinner rush, and then you play the last set of the night. You get a separate check for the performance. And if you want to put out a tip jar for the piano, it's all yours." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. It wasn't a $1 million record deal. It wasn't a world tour. It was a compromise, but it was the best kind of compromise. It was a way to honor her responsibilities to her family while finally honoring the part of herself that she had starved for so long. She could pay the bills, but she could also feed her soul. "I would love that," she whispered. "Thank you." The following weekend, the restaurant was packed. But the vibe was different. The crowd was respectful and excited. They weren't just there to drink wine, they were there to listen. Elena worked the dinner rush, moving efficiently through the tables, refilling glasses, and taking orders. But the energy was different. People recognized her from the video. They treated her like a guest of honor rather than staff. At 9 p.m., the busy service slowed down. The lights dimmed even lower than usual. The manager nodded at Elena from across the room. She untied her apron and draped it over the chair, just like she had done before. But this time, she wasn't shaking. This time, she wasn't doing it because of a broken speaker system or a panic. She was doing it because it was her time. She walked to the piano and sat down. The room went quiet instantly. There was no confusion, no whispers of "who is that?" Everyone knew. She took a breath, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. The music poured out of her, smoother and more confident than before. She played the same song she had played that first night, but it sounded different. It wasn't just sad anymore, it was triumphant. It was the sound of someone finding their way back home. In the audience, people were silent. Some held hands. Some closed their eyes to let the music wash over them. In the back, the manager leaned against the wall, watching the customers finally understand what he now knew. Elena played until her fingers were tired, and when she finished, the applause was even louder than the first time. But this time, it didn't scare her. She stood up and bowed, a real bow, accepting the love that the room was offering her. She walked off the stage, not disappearing into the kitchen, but stopping to talk to people who wanted to tell her how her music had touched them. She realized then that she hadn't just played a song. She had broken the invisible wall she had built around herself. She was still a waitress, and she was still a daughter taking care of her family. But now, she was also Elena the pianist. She had learned that you don't have to erase your past to survive, and you don't have to lose yourself to be responsible. As she walked out of the restaurant at the end of the night, the cool city air felt good against her face. The streets were noisy and bright, but for the first time in a long time, the noise didn't bother her. She had her own music in her heart, and finally, the whole world was listening.